All right. So then, I guess it begs the question: how much should one train?
Yeah. So when we take a mesocycle of training, so we take a 4 or 5 week block, we increase volumes and intensities through the weeks to make sure the overload principle is being followed. What happens is we accrue some adaptations, right? We get better every week, every microcycle, but we also accrue some fatigue. Okay. So that's the so first thing is if your performance increases every single time you come to the gym, you're probably not overloading enough because you're not fatigued enough to mask that performance. On the other hand, if you're getting worse every time you come to the gym, noticeably worse, that you can't lift the same sets and reps and weights, your fatigue levels are so high, you're probably training much more than you can recover, literally by the definition of recovery, which is reestablishing historical past performance. And then you're probably doing way too much. So the answer is within a mesocycle, most of the training sessions should have you training at about the same performance capacity. Earlier in the mesocycle, you should be able to improve on your abilities, but later in the mesocycle, you should be kind of starting to stall out before you deload. So on average, during that time, you should feel just about as good every single session as you did the last session. Now, you don't go to your limits in the first session. You maybe go here and your limit is here, but you come up, 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 up slowly, and then you deload. So the sweet spot for most mesocycle design and conventional hypertrophy is, are you training up to the point where you're pushing your ability to recover? Which means that if you're getting much better through a mesocycle, so for example, you benched 150 kilos for a set of 5 1 week, and the next week you benched 155 kilos for a set of 7, then man, you probably just didn't accumulate that much fatigue in the first week, and you probably weren't training hard enough. On the other hand, if you benched 150 for 5 1 week and you benched 150 for 1 the next week, yeah, you really did way too much, and that's probably not going to do you any good. So the idea is you don't try your hardest in the first week. You go maybe 4 reps away from failure, that repetitions in reserve method people are talking about now, which I've been using for forever. Maybe 2 reps or 3 reps in reserve for the next week, 1 or 2 reps in reserve, take it to failure in the last week, and then deload. But through that entire time, your performance, basically on a 10 rep calculator or something, should be roughly equivalent. If you are way too energetic in any one of those times, except for the first week, you're probably not training enough. If you are totally smashed, you've been training way too much. So what I would say is that's how you find what we'd call your maximum recoverable volume, your MRV. Now,
Right.
that's the most you can recover from and still have your abilities. Now, mind you, that is, you're recovering from that while you're accumulating fatigue, because that entire time you're actually accumulating fatigue, which means that if you performed X in week 1, okay, you performed the same X in week 5 before you deloaded, we know that your fatigue has gone up quite a bit through that entire time. So how the hell is it that you can perform the same at the 5th week with that much more fatigue? Well, the answer is you gained adaptations. That makes sense. So it's the only way you can repeat that kind of performance. Is, remember, imagine if you didn't get better at all during training. The first week, you're not very fatigued. You're just deloaded. The 5th week, you're fatigued as hell. You'd expect to drop, but you don't. So how do we tell that you're probably getting your best rate of adaptations? Is if you perform the same in week 1 as you do in week 5. If you perform much better, then you probably could have trained much harder, because then when you deload, you get much better in that case. If you perform much worse, then, well, you haven't supplied much of an overload the entire time because you were too fatigued. So that's, in a general sense, how we define maximum recoverable volume. Now, that already takes into account that there's going to be a high rate of adaptation there. However, you might get a little bit more adaptation because of this. If you have a certain amount of energy or a certain amount of resources you're using in your muscle for recovery, which means a return to past performance, you may actually get better results because you're taking away, so you're using all of your resources for recovery. If you trained a little less hard, you would have more resources left over for actual processes of adaptation. Does that make sense? So you're no longer just trying to recover, but you have a little bit more to adapt. Now, we know through the various physiological costs of adaptation, like the literal physical cost of muscle building and other things, probably not very high. So it's not like your MRV is going to be 20 sets per body part, and your MAV, maximum adaptive volume, is going to be like 10. It's not like that. It's probably more like your MRV is like 20, and your MAV is like 17 or 18 or something. That's my best estimate in reading literature, working with athletes, thinking about this a whole lot. So I would say, how do you know that you're training as hard as you can? If you bench 150 for 3 sets of 5 in the first week, and after accumulating a shitload of volume, doing really hard training, getting super fatigued, still being able to bench 150 for 5 in the last week, right? And if you can do that, you know that, man, you've gotten a whole lot better because you're doing what you used to do, but with all the fatigue in the world slammed on top of you. Then you know that you're probably adapting really, really well. But if you hit a PR in your last week, you probably think, man, I hit a PR before I deloaded. Am I really accumulating that much fatigue? And if you answer the question with no, then am I really supplying that much overload? Because remember, anytime we supply overload, we get fatigue. So if I didn't accumulate a lot of fatigue, I probably could have worked harder, right? A good analysis of am I getting better has to occur after deloading, not before. Does that make sense? So if you're better before you deload, man, maybe you don't even really need to deload, and then you're definitely not training hard. Now, on the other hand, if you get worse through the mesocycle, you're training way too hard. You're not recovering, and you're literally preventing yourself from overloading the entire time. So I think that's probably the best general, reasonable approach to know that you're doing your best in the gym.
Fantastic, and that brings to my two quick questions. One is that when you know you have to deload, is that based on some kind of benchmark that you're looking for, or is this just simply a predetermined point?
Well, so it should be a predetermined point that you move around through autoregulation based on your experiences. So when you start training, you can deload once every 4 weeks or 5 weeks. But you may notice that based on how you're training, you don't need to deload in the 4th or 5th week. Maybe you need to deload every 6 weeks. But maybe if you change some lifestyle variables, or as your body matures, or you try a different training style, that you get beat up much earlier and you need to deload earlier. So I would have a pre-programmed deload, but sometimes it's okay to extend it, or just take the deload anyway. And then next mesocycle, be like, okay, that deload was way too early. I'm just gonna, I'm gonna do a longer cycle this time. How do you know you have to deload? By the definition of recovery. Are you recovered enough to continue to supply an overloading stimulus, the same magnitude of overloading stimulus that you had been, right? That is the big question. So, if you normally bench 150 for sets of 5 on a good day, then, if you, on a 4th week, you hit, 160 for sets of 5 or sets of 4 grinders, barely there. Okay, you're doing really well. Like, you even got a little better, but you weren't trying as hard, right? So we have to remember the repetitions are visually. So 150 for 5 with 3 reps left in the tank roughly equates to 160 for 5 with like 1 rep in the tank, right? Or just failure. So you think, okay, I'm just about as strong. This is great because I'm holding a ton of fatigue. Obviously, I'm just gonna, when I drop the fatigue, it's gonna reveal that I've gained a lot of fitness. Okay, this is going really well. You come in next week, you're like, I'm gonna do another week, and you hit 165 for 2, 1, and then 0 reps. Okay. Have you recovered? Like, by the literal definition, you have not. Now, that could have been like you broke up with your girlfriend that weekend and you had huge fights and she literally beat your ass and you tore both your pecs trying to hit her in the face and you had the worst weekend ever and you didn't sleep at all. And maybe, but just in general, on normal training, if you find yourself continuing to try to train for 5 weeks and every time the 4th week fucks you up and you've got way too much accumulated fatigue, you got to deload on that 5th week. Does that make sense? So how do you know when it's time to deload? When you can no longer present an overload. Which is funny that you talk to some people that say they don't deload. And my question to them, like, do you just linearly get better forever? Like, do you just continue to increase weight and sets and reps for months? If that's the case, wow, like, I want to know what you're taking. But so I think but the biggest reason people don't take deloads is because they never really push it. So you have to push it in training. You have to overload enough fatigue to start accumulating. When fatigue accumulates so much that you cannot overload anymore, that is when the deload occurs.
Yeah, right. Now, what would you think of like an auto-regulated deload within sessions? So let's say you fail to hit your rep target in a certain exercise and you just omit the next sets, and then next session you try to hit the PR again.
I think there's some really good times and places for that. I think every single program needs to be somewhat auto-regulated, but there are types of fatigue mostly related to connective tissue healing, nervous system healing, some hormonal balancing. Those types of fatigue literally do not come down within a microcycle. They have to take a week or longer to bring down. So the kinds of fatigue that get recovered when you're talking about session to session is glycogen repletion, some neural characteristics. But if you never deload, especially never take some weight off the bar, you continue to stress the muscles and tendons in very similar force parameters, and then you'll get injured sooner or later. So there's absolutely a time for autoregulation, so that if you're, for example, accumulating too much more fatigue than you thought you would, you can take a planned light, unplanned light day. They basically come in, hit your first set. Well, I'm fucked. Easy on the second set, leave before you go to the third. The next week you can hit it again. But that's not a sustainable strategy for training without deloads. That's just something you do when your strategy hasn't worked out and you need to make sure you hit your numbers. It's something to do as a kind of a backstop. But your deload should still be planned to occur regularly, because deloading does more recovery than anything you can do with just a light lift. Does that make sense? Like a whole week of lighter lifting is needed every now and again. There are bigger things than deloads. There are active rests, right? An active rest phase is sometimes 2 weeks long. It occurs at the end of a meet prep cycle or at the end of a year. Those are designed to heal almost everything and build up your ability to train for another year. So for example, if you have kind of a nagging pain in your knee, if you take a light session, just one, and then you come back and hit it hard again, the pain gets better, but it doesn't go away. And then after the hard session, it's back. If you do a deload, the pain almost goes away. And for the first couple of weeks of training after, you're doing really well. But then like week 3 and 4, just when you need to be hitting PRs, is when it starts to hurt again and you start having to take light days again. It sucks. But an active rest phase of 2 weeks long may allow your knee to be so unbothered by overload for that long, such easy training for 2 weeks, that it completely heals, and then it gives you a year of training. Does that make sense? So I think there's definitely times for unplanned autoregulation, but that has to be part of a planned system. And actually, Dr. Hoffman and I, one of my colleagues, we're writing a recovery book. It's going to be out, we don't know when, because we have a shitload of other projects that bumped it to later. But one of the things we'll be talking about is we have a huge chapter about deloading, more or less, about fatigue management. And what we say in there is that auto-regulation strategies have benefits that pre-planned strategies never will, but they also don't have as much reach as pre-planned strategies do. Pre-planned strategies are way too rigid to only use, but they have very big key roles that are indispensable. So when people ask, hey, so do you auto-regulate or do you have pre-planned strategies? The answer is both. The answer is both. And every intelligent high-level sport training system has both. I don't know of a single high-level sport training system which the coach doesn't give the athletes an option to take it easy every now and again. And I don't know a single system where the coach doesn't say, hey, athletes, I don't give a shit how you feel. This week we're more resting than we are lifting.
So yeah, pre-planned or not pre-planned, the answer is yes. That is very interesting, and I'm very curious of when that book's gonna come out. I imagine now a lot of people who are a proponent of autoregulation or exclusively autoregulation will say that, well, if you have a nagging pain, that means that your exercise selection or exercise routine was not sustainable to begin with. So that is the problem, and not the lack of deloads.
But I think that's I think that's the very shallow response, because any high-level athlete will tell you that training hard comes with injuries. There is no way to avoid them. A lot of injuries occur when you're doing nothing wrong. They just happen. One of my mentors, Dr. Mike Stone, who's 250 peer-reviewed publications in sports science, a god, okay, has been coaching everyone or whatever. I asked him once, Doc, when do injuries happen? He says, Mike, you would think they happen when their accumulated fatigue is really high, and you tend to get the nagging ones like that. But some of the worst injuries I've ever seen are when people feel great. And it's just when they feel great that they can produce enough force to give their body something it's never handled before, and it snaps. So folks that say, and actually, if you don't mind, I really want to address this really quickly. There are two potential underlying realities of injury occurrence. One is kind of like you hinted at, there's something wrong with your program, and that very may well be the case. Is shit happens. You're overloaded. When you see someone doing front squats, even with great technique, does it look like the safest thing in the world? Well, if you had to bet, are they going to get injured or is someone going to get injured sitting on a couch? Which one would you bet? You don't just sit on a couch and go, oh my God, my quad ripped off. That doesn't happen, right? So even with good technique, exercise, we're throwing ourselves into the fire. We're putting ourselves in harm's way. It's called overload for a reason. It's over the body's ability to normally experience. That is, it's like combat. No matter how good a military gets in combat, people die in combat. People get shot at. And that doesn't matter how awesome your sniper rifle is, how great your tactics are. The enemy shoots back, and even if you're that much better and you do everything right, you still, every now and again, really bad shit happens, right? So we have to understand that if we get hurt, we have to do our best to figure out what went wrong. To know in the back of our minds that sometimes the answer is nothing. If shit happens, and you just have to do your best. You have to recover from the injury and just keep going, right? Because sometimes what ends up happening is that when folks get really carried away with trying to figure out why they got hurt, they turn into paralysis by analysis kind of individuals, where they watch like every Kelly Starrett video on loop for forever, and they message Quinn Henoch and say, hey, I think everything's wrong with every part of me, and I'm imbalanced, and I need 50 trillion hours of mobility because I was built wrong. God decided to just fucking put my legs where my arms were supposed to be because I'm that uncoordinated. And they start to look for reasons and reasons and reasons. And you're like, so how'd you get hurt? And they're like, well, I was deadlifting, and then like I pulled a muscle in my lower back. And I'm like, fucking welcome to deadlifting, dude. If you're trying hard, that shit happens sometimes. So yeah, there's a good idea to look for injury reasons, and most of the time there are good reasons that you could fix, but you can't fix them all. So when people say, oh, it's just something wrong with your program, it might not just be something wrong with your program. You do everything correctly and still get hurt.
Okay, mind blown. And then okay, so essentially what you're saying, if I'm interpreting it correctly, is that simply by nature of overloading, if you're doing it enough, that's always another opportunity to get hurt.
Absolutely. It's your job to do it best. I will say this. I'm not being a proponent of just saying 3 sheets to the wind and let's just fucking train, brother, and who gives a shit, and we'll just tear ourselves up because it's part of training. Because overload is already so injury risky as opposed to not doing anything, it is our duty in the gym as proper, intelligent, scientifically minded trainers to do as good of technique as we ever have. I'll tell you what I do take a lot of pride in. I love being a professor. I love being a whatever bodybuilder, jiu-jitsu grappler. I love the fact that pretty much nobody can talk shit about my videos of me lifting technique-wise. I'm a fucking stickler. I'm sure you've seen some of them. I don't fucking make mistakes. I just don't. Why? Because they're fucking hard enough as it is. I don't need any other good reason to injure myself. I'm trying to stay as safe as humanly possible. So people are like, yeah, man, like your technique looks almost, I've literally had people say like, it almost looks too good. Like, what the fuck does that mean? Like I bent rode 315, like 145 kilos for, 4 sets of 10. And someone's like, I mean, like you could probably heave a couple more. I'm just like, are you fucking kidding me? Right? Like, so training is already, I've gotten hurt doing bent rows when I was doing them perfectly. You just pull them out, something goes, that's it. So I want to do as good of a job in the gym with technique as I can so that there's no additional reason for me to get hurt. That makes sense? And so I'm not advocating the fact that you should just be like, well, whatever, injuries happen. You got to do your absolute best to make sure they don't happen, which means proper technique, number one. Proper fatigue management, number 2, making sure you take deloads and rest days and light days. Proper programming. Don't like, oh, I squatted 200 kilos. Next, I'm going to squat 250. Like, okay, you're going to skip 210, 220, 230, right? Dumb shit like that. You definitely don't want to do that. So proper programming. But after you've taken care of all of those, sometimes shit happens. And then it's always up to you after shit happens to look over your plan as diligently as you can, get other intelligent people. Chad Wesley Smith and James Hoffman are my go-to people for that, and Jared Feather, another friend of mine. I ask them after I get hurt, look at my plan. Do I look like I'm fucking doing anything wrong? And they'll say, yeah, I think this is really too much deadlifting, or you should have deloaded here and there, or I saw your technique and it wasn't as good as you usually think it is. But sometimes they say, and I'll look and I say, I really did everything as best as I could. And you can't do anything by definition any better than you could, right? So just chalk it up to shit happens. Write down when you got hurt. Maybe later you'll figure out you're doing something wrong when you know more. But heal, go back and hit it. I've been hurt benching, squatting, and deadlifting. I don't even know how many times. A ton. I still bench, squat, and deadlift, and almost never get hurt. It's just every now and again. A lot of guys, and you know what? Another really quick thing while I'm ranting, some people will abandon exercises altogether because they got hurt on them a couple of times. And it's not even statistically even any more likely that they got hurt. It just happens to be like, oh, I don't do bench press because like I pulled my pec once. Well, like, how many times have you bench pressed? I got like 10,000. How many times have you pulled your pec? Once. Wow, holy shit. Like that's definitely 1-to-1, right? So a lot of times when you get hurt in an exercise, yeah, it's good to stay away from it for a while, a lot of it because it's psychological. And also so you're not stressing that area and letting it heal, but then you got to ease back in. Like I hurt my knee, not even squatting, I don't even know how I hurt my knee, probably jujitsu or something. It's just like one of those things that started hurting. I have no idea why. So I did mostly leg presses and lunges for a while and just like really lightweight Smith machine squats. Then I started going heavier on Smith machine squats. My knees started feeling pretty good. And then eventually I transitioned back to regular high bar squats, which were killing me just before that. And now they feel great again. So is it one of those things like, oh, high bar squats, like they're what hurt my knee and I can't do them? No, like I'm back in full force and I'm just going to keep trying. Sometimes injuries just happen. So there's got to be that balance. There's like stupid bro on the one hand who like swings all the weight around and like gets hurt once a day and he's like, whatever, a sacrifice, brother. And then there's like, PT student, first year PT student that weighs 56 kilos and thinks he's always hurt all the time, and he thinks he's always a problem with his programming, and he never actually presents an overload because he's too scared to get hurt. So you got to be somewhere in the middle there. Do your best, and then injuries still happen. You just have to analyze them, and if it's just shit happens, then you just heal and keep going.